Imagine waking up and finding out a fast food soda company is suddenly armed with military submarines. It sounds like a ridiculous sci-fi movie, but in 1989, it actually happened. For a brief, bizarre moment in history, Pepsi possessed the sixth largest military fleet on the entire planet. They had enough firepower to rival entire nations. But how on earth does a sugary American beverage corporation end up commanding a Soviet naval armada? The story begins decades earlier, at the height of the Cold War. It was 1959, and tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union were at an absolute boiling point. Both nations were desperate to prove their way of life was superior. To ease the friction, the two superpowers agreed to host cultural exhibitions in each other's countries. The Americans set up a massive display in Moscow to show off capitalist luxuries. Vice President Richard Nixon traveled to Moscow, leading Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev on a tour of a model American home. The two leaders immediately started arguing. Their heated exchange over capitalism versus communism became known as the famous kitchen debate. The room was sweltering, the cameras were flashing, and Khrushchev was visibly angry and sweating. As tensions boiled over, a clever Pepsi executive named Donald Kendall saw the ultimate marketing opportunity. He boldly approached the barrier and handed the furious Soviet leader a cup of ice-cold Pepsi. Khrushchev took a skeptical sip. His eyes went wide. He loved it so much that he immediately asked for another cup and then demanded his officials try it too. The press snapped photos, and the Soviet people followed suit. Almost overnight, an entire communist nation was absolutely hooked on the sweet taste of American capitalism. But Pepsi quickly ran into a massive, multi-million-dollar problem. The Soviet ruble was essentially a closed currency. It was completely worthless anywhere outside of the Soviet Union. Pepsi couldn't accept Soviet money because they couldn't spend it back home. If they wanted to tap into this massive new market, they had to get incredibly creative. The two sides sat down and struck one of the most bizarre barter deals in history. Pepsi would trade their secret soda syrup in direct exchange for Russian vodka. Specifically, they traded for Stolichnaya vodka. Pepsi secured the rights to become the exclusive importer of the Russian liquor to the United States market. The barter deal was a massive success. Pepsi factories popped up all across the Soviet Union, becoming the very first capitalist product to be manufactured inside the USSR. By the late 1980s, the Soviets were completely obsessed. They were drinking over 1 billion servings of Pepsi every single year. The demand was absolutely staggering. But just as business was booming, disaster struck the Soviet economy. The Russian invasion of Afghanistan led to a strict international boycott of Soviet goods, including their vodka. Suddenly, the deal was broken. Americans refused to buy Stolichnaya, meaning Pepsi had rivers of soda flowing into Russia, but absolutely nothing of value coming back out. The Soviet government panicked. Pepsi was threatening to pull out of the country entirely, and the government was desperate to keep their citizens supplied with their favorite sugary drink. They couldn't pay Pepsi in cash, and they couldn't pay them in vodka. The Soviet Union was going broke. So, they offered the only thing they had left in abundance. They offered heavy military hardware. In 1989, the Soviet Union and Pepsi signed what might be the most ridiculous corporate contract in the history of global business. The Soviets agreed to trade an entire naval fleet in exchange for $3 billion worth of Pepsi. It was an unprecedented transfer of military power to a private company. The haul was absolutely massive. Pepsi received a fleet of 17 diesel-electric attack submarines, straight from the Soviet naval reserves. But that wasn't all. To sweeten the deal, the Soviets also threw in a massive cruiser, a heavily armed frigate, and a destroyer ship. Almost overnight, Donald Kendall, the CEO of a company that sold sugar water, found himself commanding the sixth largest naval fleet in the entire world. The situation was so absurd that it even caught the attention of the United States government. The U.S. National Security Advisor actually called Pepsi to ask what was going on. Kendall, reveling in the bizarre situation, famously joked to the National Security Advisor, "We are disarming the Soviet Union faster than you are." It was a funny joke, but it highlighted a massive shift in global power. A corporation was successfully negotiating what the military had been trying to do for decades. Now, obviously, Pepsi didn't actually want to start a corporate war, and they had zero interest in patrolling the oceans to protect their soda shipments. The submarines they received were completely obsolete. They were rusting, outdated, and essentially useless for any kind of modern combat. But Pepsi didn't care about their combat readiness. To the soda company, the true value of this massive naval fleet was entirely in the raw materials. Pepsi immediately turned around and sold the entire fleet of warships and submarines to a commercial scrap recycling company located in Sweden. The massive warships were chopped up, the steel was melted down, and the entire fleet was transformed into cold, hard cash to pay for the soda. It was a brilliant, ruthless, and highly profitable solution to an international trade crisis. Pepsi had successfully navigated the collapse of a superpower. The company took their scrap metal money, reinvested it, and continued to pump billions of gallons of soda into the thirsty Russian market. Unfortunately for the Soviet government, their citizens' thirst for Pepsi ended up vastly outlasting the empire itself. Just 2 years after this historic and bizarre naval trade, the Soviet Union collapsed entirely, breaking apart into independent nations. Pepsi was left scrambling to renegotiate their contracts with the newly formed Russian Federation, a process that took years to figure out. But the legend of the Soda Navy remains one of the wildest and most unbelievable moments in the history of modern finance. It proved that in the high-stakes world of global business, cash isn't always the only king. Sometimes, a fleet of attack submarines is just as good. If you enjoyed this crazy piece of history, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more untold stories of bizarre financial heists.